Imagine he spent years breaking other men's hounds, feeding them scraps, oiling their ears, teaching them to trail his own people through cane and cypress. On a moonless night when the river ran out like black iron, the kennel gates slipped on their hinges and a ferry rope began to sing in the current. He drove the pack without a word, then turned them on the very yard that kept them hungry. But when the escape began, the bell at the bluff rang early and the wind shifted upriver, pushing the ferry broadside toward the pilings. Would the current take the plan, or the plan take the current? Before we dive in, subscribe if you value original investigations, new cases every week. The story surfaced in the blue hour of a recent autumn. On September the 21st, 2024, a maintenance crew clearing flood silt from the old under-the-hill ferry landing in Natchez pried loose a barrel rim with an iron hoop still intact. Inside lay a canvas-wrapped stack gone glass-hard with salt, paper corners fused into crystalline hems. When conservators at a small parish archive thawed the pages under low heat, a ledger from the Natchez District Ferry Office emerged bearing an impossible column: salt for hounds, cross-tallied against ferry chits, and in careful script, 4 names not found in any plantation roll. A photograph traveled fast, a white barrel head stamped with a smeared crest, the ledger opened to a page where Salt had memorized each loop of ink. On that page, a night-long buried began to breathe. In 1851, the system under the bluff ran like a clock you could not refuse. The plantation quarters sat 300 steps inland from the river road, a row of 5 cabins with packed earth floors and chimneys patched with broken brick. Beyond them, the yard opened to the storehouse, the smokehouse, and the kennel, a low shed with slatted walls where 6 hounds paced grooves into the clay. Each day began with the pre-dawn bell from the bluff chapel and the calls of geese lifting off the backwater. The overseer, Abner Pike, rode the quarter-mile from the big house with a cane and a coil of rope, measuring work by the body and the hour. The county ferryman kept his schedule on a board marked with charcoal, first crossing at blue light, then at mid-morning, then at noon glare, then at last light unless the river ran too high or wind shear pressed the flatboat sideways into the pilings. Isaiah Grice learned early that every part of this world had a seam, and that dogs were taught to ignore every seam except the one under your heel. He had been a kennel boy since he could carry a bucket. He knew which hound would bite a chain and which would seize a scent like a letter and refuse to drop it. He carried tallow in a tin and rubbed their paws to keep the pads from splitting on gravel. The overseer called it care. Isaiah knew it was preparing a blade. Years later, when the plantation sold him downriver and then pulled him back to work the ferry under a parish contract, it was called logistics. He called it the river, teaching him new seams. Isaiah's competence lived in his hands, the way he set hinges so they whispered, the way he took a knot between thumb and palm and felt the grain run true. He learned to read the current by the texture of its skin and to count a crossing by the bell on the bluff. He also carried a wound that did not scab. 3 winters before the salt ledger would be written, the pack ran a girl into the cane and broke her heel with their weight. Isaiah had rubbed those same ears with tallow the night before. He held her until the yelling stopped and then could not speak for days. After that, he washed the tallow tin in lye and kept it empty. When he stood in the ferry shed at blue hour, he traced the empty seam with his thumb until the skin was polished smooth. That ritual, small and private, was where his nights began. The antagonists of his world were not just men, but men with instruments. Abner Pike, the overseer, believed pain made neat rows. He owned a set of iron brands shaped like letters used to mark barrels, and he had filed one to a thin point he called his scalpel. He measured control in distances, how far a man could run before a hound's stride erased the gap. His weakness was mathematics. He loved to count too much. Numbers pleased him into complacency. Silas Rook, the landholder who kept the parish contract for the ferry, managed with paper and favor. He sat at a desk in a front room with shutters that never opened all the way. He kept a ring of keys too large for any single purpose, letting it clatter against the desk like thunder when he thought someone needed to hear how many locks he could open or close. His method was scarcity. Ration salt, ration time, ration crossings. His weakness was reputation. A rumor that could stain his name frightened him more than any knife. Ephraim Bell, the parish clerk, maintained the rolls in the ferry ledger. He marked chits for crossings, tabulated purchases of rope and iron spikes, and signed off on meat and salt. He drank quietly and kept his handwriting beautiful even when his hands shook. He invented pen strokes the way other men invented stories. His weakness was the ledger itself. He believed that if it lived on paper, the world would obey it. A fourth antagonist came by season rather than by title. The pack of 6 hounds trained for men, not deer. Their collars were tied with brass tags stamped in letters, and their names were old family names treated like jokes. They learned their owners' vices with their noses. Their weakness was hunger and the hand that fed them. The signature artifact of Isaiah's plan would be a ledger, because numbers lulled the men who needed lulling. It would be wrapped in canvas and salted because salt preserved meat and sometimes truths. His method would be misdirection married to animal handling. Make the dogs believe the yard was quarry. Make the men believe the ferry book proved nothing happened. Silent tools would carry the weight, hinge pins smoothed with tallow, a decoy keyring cut from scrap iron and polished to a dull shine, a ferry rope spliced with a hidden release. The system's routines set the board. At blue hour, the first crossing took the clerk's basket toward the east bank, where a cotton buyer waited with promissory notes. At noon glare, the flatboat carried barrels of salt from the storehouse to the smokehouse and sometimes back again. The yard boys hauled ash to the garden. On Sundays, the chapel bell rang slower, and the overseer's rounds were shorter. Dogs ate offal from the smokehouse and were kept lean on purpose. The night pen for the dogs faced the road, not the quarters, because fear was a fence that needed to be seen. From the first pages of the salt ledger, the evidentiary chain began to seat itself. A decoy keyring lay under a plank in the ferry shed, 5 rings linked into one to catch the light and satisfy the ear. A kennel gate pin had been replaced with one Isaiah made from softened iron, the head forged just uneven enough to turn with a thumb. A rusted lock from the smokehouse hung where a stronger one once had been, decoy for a night when seconds would matter. A salt barrel marked for the smokehouse had been rolled to the ferry shed and chalked with a different tally mark. A handful of ferry chits with dates left blank waited in a tin, slid open at the fold to accept names that did not yet exist. Each object waited like a reef just under the surface. The enslaved population of this place numbered 40 souls by the parish tax account, but the quarters kept their own arithmetic. Isaiah counted dogs, not men, because dogs were the tools the white men trusted most. 6 hounds, 4 buildings that mattered to them on any given night: the kennel, the smokehouse, the storehouse, the ferry shed. 2 crossings that could be turned into one if the wind cooperated. 1 bell that told the body when to move. He sketched a map in his head, and then under a loose board in the ferry shed, using charcoal and ash. He labeled the quarters row, the yard, the storehouse, the smokehouse, the kennel, the river road, the ferry landing, and the cypress cut, where a hidden trail led downriver through reed beds. He measured the spaces by steps. He timed the overseer's ride by the sound of hoof on packed clay. There was one unexpected witness in Isaiah's life who did not yet know she would witness. A child who carried scraps to the hounds because she was fast and small, able to slip between slats without spooking the pack. She watched without understanding why the hinge moved easier under her hand one week than the last. She counted rings on the ferryman's belt when he stooped to scratch a dog's flank. She would later remember a smell like iron and rain and tell no one, because telling had never brought her good. The modern discovery had shown what names were written that should not exist. In the ledger's salted pages, 4 identities appeared in tidy ink: Jonas King, Mercy Lane, Ruth Pike, Abram Bell. None belonged to the 40. Each matched a ferry chit dated to a night when crossings should have been 2, not 3. Each name might serve to purchase meat or rope without drawing a ration from the storehouse, to explain salt that went missing, to balance a column when goats were sold and dogs were fed. Each identity was a seam Isaiah could use to slide a body between numbers and ghosts. The wound that hardened Isaiah's motive was a sound he could not unhear, the way the hounds went quiet, not when they slept, but when they had cornered. Silence meant the bite was near. The night they took the girl down, the pack had fallen silent under the fig tree for 3 breaths before the yard erupted. That silence became his metronome. He kept it with him on the ferry, listening for the moments when the river quieted before the rope shivered. He waited not for the dogs to bark, but for them to go still. Storms traveled the river in their own arithmetic. In late autumn, a wind shear could flatten the surface at dusk and lift it again before dawn. Isaiah learned to read the willow leaves on the bank. When they showed pale undersides, the wind would rise against the current and push a flatboat the wrong way. He needed a night when the wind would die to nothing, and the bellman up on the bluff, old bones stubborn with habit, would ring late instead of early. Schedules were instruments, instruments failed. In the weeks before the plan, Isaiah tested his tools in the open, hiding in the obvious. He brought a salt barrel from the storehouse to the ferry shed and chalked the tally wrong, then corrected it in front of the clerk to watch which column the man touched with his finger. He slipped the decoy keyring onto a hook and let Silas Rook admire the clatter, then put it back and counted under his breath until his heart slowed. He lifted the kennel gate just far enough that the groove under the hinge polished itself bright, then sat beside the hounds and kept his hands open so they could taste his salt. He folded blank ferry chits twice, then twice again, and slid them into the canvas book where the clerk would never look because the book smelled like lard and rope. The chapel bell up on the bluff decided when men moved and when boats left and when dogs ate. On a moonless night at the turn of the season, that bell would be his last signal. In the ledger recovered from Salt, the page that mattered most bore a time stamped in words. Blue hour, first crossing delayed. Isaiah had waited years for that delay, and in Act 1 his world tightens to meet it. Down in the ferry shed, the rope hummed with current, the dogs settled in their pen, and the bell rope upstairs hung slack in a dark stairwell. When the bell moved, no one would unmove it. The night approached in measurements, 6 hounds in the pen, 4 hinges that whispered, 3 false names already salted on paper, 2 crossings expected by habit, 1 bell that would decide the window. The salt barrel stood against the shed wall with its lid reversed to hide the stamp. Under the lid waited the ledger that would tell a different truth in the morning. Above the river, the air calmed. In the yard, geese slept with their heads under wings. Isaiah stood with his hand on the ferry rope, thumb on the splice he had made weeks ago, and counted the breaths between the wind's last touches. When the chapel bell finally swung, it would not be on time. The plan rose from small frictions Isaiah had learned to read. The hush before hounds commit, the way a hinge breathes when its pin is lifted a hair, the shallow eddy that forms under the ferry's bow when wind and current disagree. He did not invent new tools. He nested familiar ones into a sequence that looked like an ordinary evening until it did not. The blue hour flattened the river to pewter. Geese stitched low lines over the backwater. Up on the bluff, the chapel bell rope hung motionless. Isaiah's first move belonged to the kennel because the kennel decided how long the yard remained intelligible. He carried a small gunny sack from the smokehouse, heavy with offal salted for the dog's ration. He had set the kennel's inner hinge pin weeks before, filing the head just off true so a thumb could turn it with steady pressure. He crouched at the slatted wall, the 6 collars clinking, as noses pressed the gaps. He placed the sack just outside the pen where the clay held an old track leading to the yard, then rubbed his empty tallow tin along the gate's edge to leave the ghost of fat without the food. A dog's eye learns to read where smell points. The tin would draw them to wood and iron, not to men. He eased the forged pin a quarter turn. The gate breathed. The pack stilled in the way he needed, the silence that comes when instinct tightens like wire. He set a small wedge of willow under the gate's far corner and walked away as if he had forgotten the sack. Behind him, a long exhale. Not yet. The second set piece was paper, because paper governed how men chose to see. In the ferry shed, the salt barrel stood with its lid reversed to hide the stamp. He rolled it close to the bench, pried the top, and lifted the canvas-wrapped book seated in Act 1. The salted ledger, twin to the parish book, held blank leaves that crackled. He removed 4 folded ferry chits slit for names, the ink dry but ready to drink. He wrote with a slow hand and the steadiness of someone who had watched Ephraim Bell practice beauty for years, Jonas King, Mercy Lane, Ruth Pike, Abram Bell. Each name balanced a column that did not deserve balancing. He tamped the papers back into salt, pressed crystals to the wet letters, and laid the lid upside down again. A salt crust would bloom by dawn and make ink look old. Silas Rook's front room sat with shutters half closed, the desk laid like an altar. Keys, sand shaker, a ledger for the ferry proper. Isaiah entered with a coil of ferry rope for splicing as pretext, the decoy keyring nested on his belt where noise would satisfy the overseer's ear if Abner Pike noticed him coming or going. He laid the rope on the floorboards and passed a splice through itself, a hidden release loop trained into the lay. Then, he slid one folded chit under the ledger's flyleaf where Ephraim Bell's hand always brushed for sand. When a man believes a number, he wrote as the only number. The presence of a second sheet made in his own style will seem to come from him. The decoy ring clattered when Isaiah stood. He watched Silas glance up from another room and see only a man who made honest noise. Back in the yard, the third set piece turned hinges and hunger into motion. Isaiah walked past the kennel as if retrieving a dropped tool and nudged the willow wedge with his boot. The gate settled a hair. The sack of offal sat like a dare between pen and yard. 6 muzzles pushed into air, then into cloth, then into space. The first dog cleared the gap and found salt and meat and the memory of yard dust. The rest followed. Isaiah kept his back squared, hands open. The pack moved along the groove he had rubbed with the empty tin, straight to the yard. Hounds trained for men would find men, but only if the first cue set their noses upright. Fat on wood became the lead. The yard became geography written by paws, clay scored with claw marks, a scatter of offal dragged across packed ground, the rusted lock on the smokehouse planted as decoy, held, and the dogs circled its seam until they convinced themselves smell lived in iron. Isaiah stepped into the storehouse to fetch a small sack of ash prepared for the ferry. He shook it in a line from the kennel to the storehouse threshold, a faint gray river. The hounds shoved through the ash, leaving prints that would later tell a clean sequence, heading away from the quarters row, toward the yard. He brushed his trousers against the fig tree where the girl had fallen years before, and left a faint dusting there too. If Abner Pike read Sign at Dawn, Sign would speak of dogs chasing meat and ash, not people moving under a moonless sky. The fourth set piece belonged to the quarters, where community logistics took a shape that could fit inside a flatboat. Isaiah had counted bodies and rolls, an elder with bad knees who could not run but could keep a lookout at the corner of the storehouse, sitting as if to rest with a sack in his lap. 2 women who wrapped infants to their bellies under coarse shawls. 3 boys too young to carry weight, but old enough to carry gravel in their fists to drop along the river road as breadcrumbs that, when read wrong, looked like a cart had passed. The child who fed the hounds waited between cabins with a folded scrap of sailcloth to throw across the kennel gate if the pack turned wrong. No one spoke. A body assumes weight the moment it declares intent. Silence kept everyone light. At last light, Isaiah took his position at the ferry landing. He set the bowline in place, wrapped the main rope around the post, and laid his thumb on the splice he had taut into the fibers. The river, at the ferry landing, breathed with a predictable pull toward the center channel. He wanted a slack pocket to hold the flatboat long enough to load, then a single clean swing into the current. The chapel's bell rope remained still in the stairwell, a dark spine against whitewash. He waited for it to be late. The countermove arrived like a miscount. The bell rang early. The first strike came before true darkness, sound fanning down the bluff in measured notes. Whoever pulled the rope on the bluff had changed his habit. Isaiah's ribs went tight. Early bell meant overseer rounds would cycle sooner. Dogs would be fed ahead of schedule. The ferry's next expected crossing would be advanced. In the same breath, the wind turned upriver in a brisk sheer, lifting the willow leaves to pale undersides. The flatboat's bow shouldered away from its pocket and pressed broadside to the pilings. Misdirection could shape men, wind reshaped water. No time to reset. Isaiah shifted to adaptation built into his rope. He took the ash sack onto the flatboat, scattered a light dusting on the deck to make footing predictable, then cut the bowline half a hair from the knot to leave a frayed tail that would look like negligence later. He worked the hidden release, let the main rope slip a controlled arm's length, and staked it with a wooden pin driven into a crack in the pier. The boat's angle changed just enough, presenting less flank to the wind. He signaled with his palm to the elder at the storehouse corner. The elder rose, shuffled as if following a routine, then disappeared along the shadow of the river road, gathering the 2 women and 3 boys one by one, as if a casual migration. They reached the landing in a staggered file that read, as drift, not escape. Isaiah set each foot on the same plank pattern to keep the deck's ash scuffs consistent. He balanced bodies by habit, heavy to the center, lighter at the stern, one infant placed in a cradle of rope coils whose smell would hide human milk. The child who fed the dogs arrived last, eyes catching on the hinge as if recognizing a whispered breath in the wood. She carried nothing. The boat took her like a grain dropped into a mill groove. Up in the yard, Abner Pike's horse clattered half a minute early. Isaiah did not look. He read the rhythm through the rope in his hand. The decoy keyring on his belt clinked at the wrong time and probably saved him. Noise as cover, routine as mask. Dogs bayed once at the smokehouse lock, then fell into the quiet Isaiah dreaded in other circumstances. Quiet now meant the pack was nose deep in a false quarry. Ephraim Bell, if he looked into his front room, would see his ledger on the desk with a stray chit slipped under the flyleaf and consider only the neatness he loved. Silas Rook, if he heard the decoy ring again, would think the ferryman had arrived to tend the boat exactly when the bell commanded. Isaiah loosened the wooden pin. The boat eased forward, then caught crosswise as the upriver wind pressed its flank. The rope hummed like a taut string. He felt the splice with his thumb, easing it quarter inch by quarter inch past the taut point where fibers threatened to seize. He needed the current to own the boat before the wind could. He watched the eddy under the bow wobble, and then form a clean, darker oval. That was the seam the river offered. He pushed the stern with a long pole exactly twice, no more, no less, to keep the scuffs on the deck matched to expected labor, not panic. The boat pivoted. The 5th set piece belonged to the Cypress Cut, a narrow, reedy channel he had charted in his head 100 nights and chalked under the ferry shed board. To reach it, the boat had to clear the last pilings without catching, then let the current carry them 2 breaths past what felt safe before he could pull into slack water under Cypress knees. Wind tried to hold the bow. Up on the bluff, the bell finished its early sequence. In the yard, a single shout rose, someone noticing dogs where dogs should not be. Silence returned. The boat slid, kissed a piling with a wooden sigh that would read as routine wear later, and then entered the seam as the rope slipped free of Isaiah's stake. He had to leave an explanation behind. He tied the cut end of the bowline to a second short length, stowed for repairs, left the knot ugly, and tossed it onto the landing where anyone could find it. A frayed tail, a sloppy knot, a scuff along the piling. These would speak to oversight, not to intent. In the salted ledger, the 4 names waited to explain salt missing from a barrel, dogs fed early, a crossing recorded at blue hour that could be mistaken for this one. Numbers would argue with shouting. He made the argument richer by reaching into the ash sack and dropping a small pinch over the knotted mess on the pier. Tomorrow's fingers would lift a dust and blame careless hands. They kept low under the cypress fringe. Isaiah feathered the pole along mud to keep the flatboat's mouth turned away from the main channel. He counted breaths, the metronome from the night the pack went quiet long ago, holding hard to routine inside deviation. One boy reached to touch a root and drew back as if burned by the cold. A heron stepped once, twice, then changed its mind and opened the slate of its wings. The child who fed the hounds put her head against the rope coil and closed her eyes, perhaps remembering the hinge's ease. An owl marked their passage with a single hard blink. Behind them, the yard rearranged itself along the prints Isaiah had supplied. Dogs had dragged offal toward the storehouse. Ash lined the threshold. The rusted smokehouse lock bore tooth scrapes where muzzles had tested its weakness. The decoy keyring on Isaiah's belt would be absent from the front room's peg and present at his hip when men with candles came to the landing. The salted ledger in the ferry shed would intrude on the official book with a twin logic. Ephraim Bell's neat hand in the parish volume would be free of corrections because the correction sat hidden elsewhere, already grained with crystals. Community logistics extended beyond bodies on a boat. In the quarters, 2 elders with old injuries shifted bedding and laid 3 spare quilts so the counted shapes matched expected sleep. Someone placed a pair of shoes by a hearth with toes pointed toward the door, the way a weary worker leaves them, to stop an overseer's eye on its first sweep. A dull kitchen knife, still wet from evening rations, lay beside a hoop of onions as if a cook had stepped outside to relieve herself. Nothing screamed absence. Everything whispered later. The counter-move continued to press. The upriver wind crept into the cypress cut, worrying the boat against a root. Isaiah bled off the angle by moving weight, elder toward center, boys toward stern, so the hull kissed the knee and slid. The infant in the rope cradle did not stir. The current under the fringe turned syrupy, almost still. That was both safety and trap. If the boat lost the thread of motion, men with poles from the main landing could find them by acorn drifts. Isaiah took the pole and drew a line in the water, barely enough power to keep orientation. He knew he could not be in two places when the morning demanded proof of ordinary. He could, however, plant that proof in objects that would out-talk questions. They reached the mouth of the cypress cut where willow shadows made a second darkness. Beyond it lay a turn into a backwater channel that would deposit them below the ferry landing along the river road bend, where a hidden cart path ran as if made for this night. Isaiah eased the pole, felt the flatboat's bow respond as if it had been waiting for the same seam. He looked once at the bluff, no light at the chapel windows, only the memory of an early bell now spent. The point of no return arrived not with drums but with the simplest motion. Isaiah opened his palm and let the splice slide the last inch. The main rope fell slack into the river and sank, the boat's only leash gone. Wind and current negotiated, found a truce, and slid them into the backwater's mouth. There would be no return to the landing to retie knots, to rehang the decoy key ring, to nudge the kennel wedge back into place. The structure of the night had changed. In the salt barrel, ink dried on names that would not match bodies in the morning. In the yard, Ash told a story Legs had edited. On the river, a flatboat erased its own wake under willow leaves. They entered the backwater and were gone to the bluff sightlines. Behind, the yard learned confusion in the order Isaiah had written into it. Ahead, the map under the ferry shed board began to unfold at true scale. The next act would no longer be planning. It would be discovery and its costs, measured in rooms where men loved procedures, and in fields where rumors traveled as fast as geese at dawn. Dawn rearranged the yard by degrees a body could read with a boot heel and a finger. The first to notice was Abner Pike, riding in at blue light with a coil of rope looped to his saddle. His horse halted at the kennel where 6 hounds stood outside the pen, jaws slicked with brine and grease, muzzles rasping the slats as if the meat were still inside wood. The gate's inner pin shone with a thumb-smooth bright spot, and a wedge of willow lay mashed to pulp beside the hinge. Across the clay, a gray ribbon of ash ran from pen to storehouse, crossed and recrossed by blunt-clawed prints. The rusted smokehouse lock bore tooth scrapes. Near the fig tree, a faint bloom of ash-dusted leaves as if weather had fallen in a careful line. Silence held in the kennel yard, the dangerous kind Isaiah had turned to metronome. At the ferry landing, a frayed tail of bowline lay in a question mark on the planks. Ash sifted over the knot like frost. The flatboat's hull wore a fresh, long scuff along one plank where it had kissed a piling at the wrong angle, and then left. The main rope hung slack in the water, ends clean where a splice had once lived, now sunk and invisible. A short repair line lay beside the frayed tail, knotted ugly, as if a tired hand had tried and failed to make sense of a bad cut. Up on the bluff, the chapel bell rope swung listlessly in the stairwell, its early ringing already burned into muscle memory. Men who ran by routine felt that miscount without needing words. Inside Silas Rook's front room, the desk was as it had been. Shutters half closed, sand shaker off to the right, the parish ferry ledger square to the desk edge. A folded ferry chit, salt-bloomed as if old, waited under the flyleaf in Ephraim Bell's hand. The entry named a crossing at Blue Hour for Jonas King, signed with a tidy flourish and priced in cents that matched nothing the ferryman had been paid. In the smokehouse, a barrel of salt marked with the storehouse stamp was missing from its usual corner. Down in the ferry shed, a barrel with a reversed lid stood where it should not. Canvas peeped from under its edge like tongue. The discovery phase progressed as these objects dictated. Men followed the ash line, measured the scuff, counted the collars. They looked into the quarters and found bedding puffed to the shape of bodies, quilts arranged in threes as if sleep had a geometry. At one hearth, a pair of shoes sat toe forward toward the door, laces spread like hands. In the storehouse threshold, the ash showed the clean pattern of hound paws and none of human heels. The child who fed the dog stood by the pen, unmoving, eyes on the hinge as if the wood might breathe again. She kept her hands hidden in her skirt. An elder on a stool pointed with his chin at the ferry landing and then looked away. No one spoke. Everyone read. By mid-morning, noon glare beginning to bite the roof shingles, the parish constable stood in Silas Rook's room with the front ledger open and a second book on the table, damp with salt at the edges. Ephraim Bell reached for a sand shaker out of habit and then set his hand on the salted canvas instead, confused by paper that had his loops and yet did not feel like his desk. The constable scraped his thumbnail across the bowline's fray, lifted ash to show the men how neglect leaves dust when a rope rubs wrong and naps at the end. In the yard, Abner Pike measured the distance between the kennel and the storehouse with long strides and a frown. He loved numbers. Numbers gave back only what had been fed into them. 6 hounds, 4 buildings, 1 missing boat. The ledger, 2 ledgers, refused to argue. On October the 2nd, 1851, the parish office convened in a long room above the mercantile. Green baize on a scarred table, windows propped with sticks cut rough from willow. The clerk recorded attendance by surname and trade, then named the matter ferry irregularities and salt discrepancies. The term for people gone was softer. Absences. Witness objects sat like additional attendees. Bowline tail, decoy keyring recovered from the ferryman's peg, a kennel pin with its head-planed skew, the rusted smokehouse lock, the ash sack with a torn mouth. The salted ledger from the ferry shed lay swaddled in its canvas like a patient. Procedure moved as it always had. The bailiff read a notice to inspect the ferry accounts. Ephraim Bell offered up the official book, columns neat and squared to the line, then blinked at the twin paper that carried his style. He admitted, in the oblique mood institutions prefer, that duplicate slips sometimes accompany chits to stabilize tallies. The room accepted this euphemism with relief. Duplication domesticated theft into accounting. Silas Rook suggested that the early Bell had prompted an unscheduled crossing to position the flatboat for a load of salt and that a hasty splice failure explained the cut rope. He did not say he had heard a decoy ring clatter at the wrong hour, but the sound sat in the back of his throat like grit. Outside that room, the river wore all sound thin. In the backwater below, the river road bend. The flatboat lay camouflaged with willow branches. Isaiah had run the cypress cut clean, then let the boat idle in a shaded pocket until noon. Glare flattened the surface. He split the party into weights and distances. The elder and the 3 boys followed a cart path that paralleled the road, moving toward a fallow field where a sharecropping family, distant kin by rumor, might hide them among drying gourds for a day. The 2 women and the infants took the flatter stretch along a drainage ditch screened by cane. Isaiah and the child who fed the hounds moved last, slough mud to their knees, following the map he had chalked under the ferry shed board to a stand of cypress, known to fishermen but useless to patrols on horseback. He had chosen destinations that made sense to bodies, not to paper. The first search party pushed off at last light on October the 3rd. 2 men with poles, one with a lantern shielded by a tin hood, scanned eddies for a hull tucked under knees. They found only acorn drifts and a heron's print set like a stamp on soft mud. On the bluff, the bell resumed its accustomed time, the late ring now restored as if the early sequence had been merely an old man's error. In the yard, the pack paced between pen and fig tree, unsettled by a story their noses could no longer finish. Abner Pike beat the ash line into dust with the flat of his rope until no trace remained. His numbers, when balanced, delivered nothing back. By October the 5th, euphemisms had hardened into minutes. The parish board recorded dereliction at the ferry, with loss of rope and supplies, and voted to dock wages that had not been paid. A notice went to the county seat to strengthen kennel discipline by moving the pen door to face the quarters instead of the road. The smokehouse received a new lock purchased from a tinsmith upriver, stamped with a brand too tidy to fool a hungry muzzle. The office decreed that the ferry ledger would henceforth be countersigned by 2 men at each crossing and that any auxiliary slips found outside the book were to be burned. Procedures tightened around the wrong joints. The body of the system learned to guard paper and iron rather than hunger and habit. There were sightings because men need them. On October the 7th, a farmer at a bend 3 miles downriver swore that at moonrise he saw a flatboat slide into reeds without a sound. On October the 9th, a woman selling eggs at the market described a boy buying coarse salt with a copper that had been filed thin on one edge, as if someone had wanted 2 coins from one. On October the 11th, a woodcutter found a coil of ferry rope buried under leaves beside a cypress knee, the splice cut clean as if a knife had listened to the line. Each report reached the desk upstairs and was written in small script at the bottom of a page, then crossed out with a faint line as if rumor could be dismissed with ink. No bodies were recovered, no oars drifted loose for men to hold up as proof. The elder and the boys were not dragged from gourds, because gourds hung dull and innocent over frames. The women and infants passed a bayou, crossing at dawn, while an egret held its balance on one leg like a stake. Isaiah and the child reached the timber camp the map had promised, a ruin of cut logs, a collapsed shed, a ring of ash inside a circle of stones, long gone cold. They left the flatboat scuttled under brush where cypress knees disguised curves. Isaiah took the tallow tin from his pocket, the polished empty he had carried for years, and set it on the stone ring, a private burial of a tool that had taught dogs to love his hands. He turned it upside down so it could not hold again. The institutional response wanted a culprit more than a cause. In mid-October, the sheriff in the county seat opened a hearing of habits at the courthouse, a room where light came hard through unwashed panes. Men spoke about bells and rope and ledgers and how some ferrymen had become careless now that crossings were paid by contract rather than by pride. A minister suggested more prayer at the Bluff Chapel before dawn. A merchant called for a new inventory of salt with weights taken weekly, not monthly. No one wrote the word that burned at the core, revenge, because paper could not hold it without catching. Weeks later, after first frost, a new overseer replaced Abner Pike. He had a quieter cane, a new set of iron brands, and a dislike for dogs indoors. The pack was muzzled at night and fed less. Silas Rook locked his desk with a key he wore on a narrow cord hidden under his shirt. Ephraim Bell stopped practicing his hand for beauty and began printing block letters, one stroke at a time, as if a change of script could repair events. The parish issued a rule that fairy chits must be written in duplicate, then the second copy sealed in a jar of brine, an attempt to borrow authority from salt that did not understand its conscription. Ledger entries for that month closed with arithmetic that balanced because ink wanted to be believed. Years ran forward. War came and unstitched the county. In 1866, during a Freedmen's Bureau review of parish accounts, a young agent paging through old books found a reference to salt for hounds, cross-tallied to names that matched no freed people's lists. He wrote a brief to Washington with a curious title, On Salted Names. Nothing followed. The office folded into other crises, but the phrase barnacled itself to local speech. Salt a name became a way to say lie cleanly. In 2024, the barrel from the ferry shed gave back its paper, and conservators read crystals like weather. The salted ledger proved the duplication was not a clerk's safety, but a ferryman's blade. 4 names sat like small lanterns: Jonas King, Mercy Lane, Ruth Pike, Abram Bell. They corresponded to purchases that could hide meat and rope, to a crossing at blue hour when a bell rang early, to a boat that disappeared into a mapped seam. Oral testimonies gathered that autumn added a final image, an old woman in a long-ago kitchen who would hum when thunder moved downriver, a scrap of melody with no words. A local teacher wrote it down in staff notation. The line rose at the place where bells ring and then dropped to a minor third that felt like a boat sliding under cypress. A student wrote a title in pencil, When the Hounds Go Quiet. The outcome for Isaiah hardened into the kind of ending men call disappearance when they do not own the map. He did not return to the landing. He did not surface in a docket. He left a flatboat under willow and a tin upside down on cold stones. Witnesses, when they were brave enough to remember, said a ferryman with scarred hands once traded 2 days' work on a timber raft for a ride to a bend where rafts break up and men vanish into counties with different surnames. The child who fed the hounds grew into a woman who stacked quilts in threes without knowing why that count soothed her at night. Legacy settled into routines and rumor paths. Kitchens along the river began storing knives edged down and tallow tins with lids askew, small superstitions against tools that make animals love the wrong hands. Kennels in the district turned their doors to face the road, then, years later, turned them back, the lesson smearing across seasons. Ferrymen along that stretch of water still test a splice with a thumb before dark and spit into the river if a bell rings off its hour. In courthouse rooms, clerks keep duplicate slips, but once a year one person opens a brine jar, reads a name aloud, and writes the word void in the margin as if canceling a ghost. The final image belongs to the object that began the story and to the sound that governed night. In the parish archive now, a salt-stiff page lies under glass, crystals glittering like frost. A photograph of the chapel bell rope hangs beside it, its fibers splayed where hands pulled too hard on a single evening and set time wrong. Schoolchildren file past in pairs. A guide asks them to notice the two books, the beautiful hand and the salted twin, and to listen for a tune. Somewhere downriver a heron lifts, the river shows its dark oval seam, and an old melody moves through a room like weather. It is not triumph. It is a superstition that learned to sing. When the hounds go quiet, count to 6, then cut your rope.